Hey Stitchers, and welcome back. Last week we talked all about discontinued yarn, and at the end of that video we talked a little bit about yarn substitution. So today we're talking about gauge, why it's important, and how to calculate it. So if you're ever trying to substitute yarn or trying to make gauge for a certain project, you'll know exactly what to do.
Sigourney, how's your macaroni?
So first we're going to talk about what is gauge exactly and why it's important. And then we'll head into making an actual gauge swatch and learning the best way to accurately measure your gauge. So first things first, what is gauge? Your gauge is basically a measurement of how big your stitches are. By definition, it's the number of stitches and rows you have in a certain given measurement, usually about 4 to 5 inches. Gauge is tension. It varies from person to person. Some crocheters crochet more tight and others crochet more loose. And even the way that you hold your hook or the way that you hold your yarn will determine your tension and how you crochet. And in the end, it will affect your gauge. So the most important thing is just to know what kind of crocheter you are and then learn how to adjust from there. Because remember, there's no wrong way. You just have to find what works best for you. If you've watched any of my tension videos, and there are a lot, you'll know that tension can be affected by anything, even something as little as your mood. And it can even change over time. A few years ago, I was working on a blanket that required making different size squares and then in the end sew it together to form a blanket. Well, I started this blanket a couple years ago and then set it aside for a long time. When I went to pick it up, I made one of the same squares, and this square turned out much smaller than my previous square. So that tells me that a few years ago I had pretty loose tension, but now it's a little bit tighter. So that just goes to show whether you're a beginner or you're more experienced, all of our tension is different and can be affected by a number of things. Now, why is gauge important? Gauge is important because it affects the measurements and the fabric of your finished project. If your gauge is off, your finished project could be too big, it could be too small, it could be too stiff, you could run out of yarn, or it could be too loose. So gauge is important for a lot of different reasons. Now I will say that gauge doesn't really matter when it comes to blankets, rugs, bags, baskets, or things like that, because the finished size doesn't have to be exact. So let's say that you're making a blanket that's 45 inches by 55 inches. If your gauge is slightly off, the blanket will be a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger depending on what your tension is like. And that's not too much of a big deal. Now, gauge is really important when it comes to sizing. So if you're making something like a garment or a hat or anything that you have to physically wear, then that's when it's important. Because if your gauge isn't right, then that particular item won't fit. This first hat was made using the correct tension from the pattern. Now this hat was made in the exact same way, except my tension was tighter. And so you can see that if I have a tight tension because I didn't match my gauge, this is what my hat would look like. It don't fit. Now if your tension is too loose but you didn't create a gauge swatch, your hat could turn out like this. That's not cute. So if you needed a visual, that is why gauge is important. And you really don't want to spend all this time creating a project and in the end it doesn't even fit. I can tell you from experience that that is one of the most frustrating things. So remember, when you're making something where the size or the fit truly matters, you'll want to make sure that you create a gauge swatch before you start making the pattern. Okay, so now that we know what gauge is and why it's important, let's talk about some tips that will help you measure your gauge more accurately. Let's say you're working on a blanket project and the beginning of your project is a lot more loose than the last few rows of your project. If it's not because of your stitch count, then it's because of your tension. And I have lots of tension videos here on this channel that you can check out that will help with that. Because you can't measure your gauge accurately if your tension is off. So if you're struggling with your tension, be sure to check out those videos. I'll leave all the links for those videos in the description box below. So the first thing that you will need is a gauge swatch and a tape measure. You can use a tape measure, you can use a ruler, and you can even get something fancy like an actual gauge ruler. Now, in order to measure our gauge, we're going to measure the number of stitches and rows per inch. Normally, when you make a gauge swatch, your best bet is to create a 5-inch square, but it really depends on the project that you're working on. Sometimes you can measure the project as you go, and other times you'll have to make a different kind of swatch. But most of the time, it will be a square swatch just like this one. Now, for today's example, we're just going to use the half double crochet. But again, all patterns are different. So if you're working on a project that has more of a textured stitch, let's say like the mini bean stitch, you will have to create a swatch using this stitch, the stitch that's used in the pattern, in order to measure your gauge. And usually the designer will tell you what to do or what kind of swatch to make within the notes. If they don't tell you, then you'll make a square swatch just like this one, using the stitch in the pattern. Now let's move on to measuring our gauge. First things first, you'll want to be familiar with counting your stitches. So if you don't know how to count your stitches yet, I have separate tutorials for the 4 basic stitches where I go over how to count each stitch and row. So you'll want to check those out if you've never been the best at counting your stitches and rows. Now, moving on. Let's first use the tape measure. This swatch that I made is about 5 3/4 of an inch wide and about 5 1/4 inch tall. Whenever you're measuring your gauge, your best bet is to measure the inside of your swatch. So we're not going to measure edge to edge because the edges can be a little wavy due to the turning chain. And same with measuring from edge to edge from top to bottom. Your foundation row can always be a little bit wonky. So if you want the most accurate measurement, you'll want to measure the inside of your swatch. So I'm going to take this row here, and you'll want to put the 0 right next to where this first half double crochet starts. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We have 13 half double crochet in 4 inches. Now to measure your rows, and we're going to find the top of one of your inner rows. So here is the top of my row here. And again, I'm going to measure down to 4 inches. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have 10 rows of half double crochet in 4 inches. So because we have 13 half double crochet in 4 inches and 10 rows in 4 inches, this is how your gauge would be written out. 13 half double crochet, or stitches, times 10 rows equals a 4-inch square. Now let's say that this is the gauge that we were trying to meet, and you made a swatch like this. Let's go ahead and measure the gauge for this swatch. First, make sure that you put your swatch on a flat surface. For our stitch gauge, we have 14 half double crochet, and for our row gauge, we have 11. So our gauge with this swatch is 14 half double crochet times 11 rows equals 4 inches. So for this swatch, we were crocheting a little bit too tight. In order to fix this, we would go up 1 hook size and we would get these measurements instead. Let's say you used a 5.5 millimeter to make this swatch. To go up a hook size, that means to use a 6 millimeter hook. Going up a hook size usually means to go up 0.5 millimeters, not a whole millimeter. Now let's say we created a swatch with more loose tension. For this one, we have 12 half double crochet stitches across and 9 rows. So that means our gauge measurement for this swatch would be 12 half double crochet times 9 rows equals 4 inches. And because the original gauge that we're supposed to meet is 13 half double crochet times 10 rows, that means we would need to go down a hook size. And here you can see the differences between each of the swatches. All 3 of these swatches were created using the same stitches and the same amount of rows. But this swatch was created using a 6 millimeter hook, this with a 5.5, and this with a 6.5. And that just goes to show how big of a difference tension makes. So if you notice that your gauge measurement has too many stitches, that means that your tension is too tight and you'll need to go up a hook size in order to match gauge. And if you notice that you have too few of stitches in your gauge measurement, then your tension is too loose and you'll need to go down a hook size in order to match gauge. So let's say that you move up or down a hook size and your stitch count is correct, but your row gauge is still off. There are a couple ways you can fix this, but it's going to take some trial and error. The first thing you can try is using extended stitches. You can do this for single, double, and half double crochets. So to create an extended half double crochet, you'll yarn over, insert your hook into the next stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through one loop, and that's creating a chain that will extend the height of your half double crochet. Then yarn over and pull through all 3 loops. And that's an extended half double crochet stitch. Now, because we're not talking specifically about extended stitches today, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I will create a tutorial about this in the future. I just wanted to show that that is an option. So how can we put this inside of a gauge swatch? Well, let's say you're creating a pattern that is all half double crochet. If your gauge doesn't meet the measurement, you can replace it with the extended half double crochet. And if we line it up here, 2 rows of the extended half double crochet is 3 rows of regular half double crochet. So you're gonna have to play around and see how you can adjust your swatch in order to meet gauge and still make that pattern. Another thing that you can do is to just make your stitch bigger. So whenever you go to half double crochet, pull up your loop a little bit more than you normally do, and then create your half double crochet. And that will make your half double crochet taller. So if you can intentionally do that throughout your project, then you can make your row gauge work. Now today we talked a lot about measuring your half double crochet swatch, but we all know that it's not always a simple stitch that you're following in a pattern. So how are you supposed to measure the gauge for a certain stitch pattern? Again, all pattern designers are different, so that's one thing that you need to keep in mind. The more you crochet, the more you'll be familiar with the different types of gauge and the different ways that pattern designers talk inside their pattern. Let's take these 2 for example. Let's say you're creating a project using the mini bean stitch. You're not going to see a gauge that will say 5 half double crochet in 4 inches because we're not using half double crochet. We're not actually using any of the basic stitches for this mini bean pattern. So for this swatch, I'm going to use my handy dandy gauge ruler. So to measure this, we're going to count by the mini bean stitch. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I would say about a half. So we have 8.5 and 4 inches. Now let's count by the rows. Again, we have another half here, so we're going to say 13.5. So our gauge for this mini bean stitch swatch would be 8.5 mini beans times 13.5 rows. So that's what it could say inside the pattern if there were a pattern for this particular stitch. Now let's try with the granny stripe stitch. There are 2 ways that this stitch could actually be calculated. They could go by the number of double crochets, or they could go by the number of double crochet clusters. So first we'll count the number of double crochet. So we have 15 double crochet in this row here, and we have 9 rows of the granny stripe stitch. So it would be 15 double crochet times 9 rows equals 4 inches. But inside the notes of the pattern, whenever you're calculating gauge, the pattern will most likely say double crochet, or it will say number of clusters. So that was the number of double crochet. Let's count the number of clusters. We have 5 double crochet clusters in each row for 4 inches. And again, we have 9 rows. So if your gauge was supposed to be measured by cluster, it would be 5 clusters times 9 rows equals a 4-inch square. Now I wish I could show you how to do this for every single stitch, but like I said previously, all designers are different, all projects are different. So really your experience is what will help you learn how to do this yourself. But I hope that that helped with the basics of measuring your gauge for different stitch patterns. Now I wanted to leave you with one final note. Sometimes it is normal to have to go up a couple hook sizes or go down a couple hook sizes in order to make gauge. And that's okay. We all have different tension, we all crochet differently, and that's perfectly fine. What you really need to do is just figure out the kind of crocheter you are and adjust from there. So my last tip is to pay attention to the hooks that you're using. Clover hooks are my absolute favorite. And because I've been using them for so long, I can no longer use these aluminum hooks. They're a lot harder for me to use now because I'm so used to the clover hooks. So whenever I'm using these hooks compared to these hooks, my tension is completely different. So if you find yourself having a hard time matching gauge, you could always try changing your hook. I 100% recommend these hooks, so if you can give them a go, you absolutely should. But if you've already tried these and you don't like them, you can always try bamboo hooks, plastic hooks, or other kinds of ergonomic hooks. All right, so that's it for today's tutorial on gauge. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial, and if you have any questions at all, just leave them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.